An injured bear cub enters a stranger's house in the middle of the night. Then this happened. The wind howled like a wounded beast through the pines of the Colorado backcountry, its icy breath lashing the darkening sky. Snow fell in thick, relentless sheets, erasing paths and swallowing sound, turning the world into a pale, frozen canvas. Daniel Hale stood at the threshold of his log cabin, a steaming mug of black coffee in one hand, the other resting absently on the doorframe. The fire crackled behind him, casting flickering light across the worn floorboards and walls, lined with old ranger maps and photos as dulled by time. Somewhere beneath the stack of firewood near the stove lay the letter he never opened. The final report from the Forest Service, documenting the wildfire that had taken his partner's life and left Daniel shattered in a way no physical wound ever could. He hadn't read it. He didn't need to. He'd lived every second of it, and now he lived in its wake. He had come to the mountains to vanish. That had been the plan. Let the seasons bury him in silence and cold. Let time wear him down like river rock, smooth and without edge. His days had become rituals, chopping wood, trapping small game, scanning the ridgeline with his old binoculars. Nights were longer, darker, filled with the ghosts of things unsaid. It was better this way, or so he told himself. Until the sound came. Faint at first, it wove through the wind like a thread. Not a branch snapping, not the shriek of a hawk. It was low, keening, half growl, half cry. A sound of pain. Daniel paused, breath steaming in the cold, ears straining to catch it again. He heard it, not far. Deep primal instinct unfurled within him, the ranger in him rising before the man could overrule it. He grabbed his flashlight, slung his old canvas coat around his shoulders, and stepped into the storm. Snow came up to his calves as he moved through the trees, boots crunching softly with each step. The beam of his flashlight danced over ice-coated branches and animal tracks barely visible beneath the drift. The cry came again, closer now. He crested a small ridge and stopped. There, at the base of a pine, half buried in snow and trembling from cold and fear, was a bear cub. For a moment, Daniel didn't breathe. The cub couldn't have been more than a year old. Its black coat was patchy with frost and blood, one leg twisted at an unnatural angle. A steel jaw trap lay rusted beside it, its cruel teeth stained with blood. The bear's breath came in quick pants, each one sending a puff of white into the frigid air. It didn't growl, didn't run. It just stared at him, wide-eyed, with a kind of hollow plea Daniel hadn't seen since the fire. It struck him like a blow. The helplessness, the surrender. He felt it in his marrow. He should have walked away. He knew that. Wild animals didn't belong inside homes. Bears didn't get second chances. They were born to fight or die, not be coddled like pets. But something cracked inside him. A memory of fire roaring through trees, of trying to lift his partner's unconscious body before the ceiling gave way, of failing, of running, of living when he shouldn't have. He dropped to his knees beside the cub. "Easy," he murmured, setting the flashlight down in the snow. "I've got you." The cub's body was ice cold under his fingers, the fur stiff and matted. Blood had crusted around the wound on its leg. It didn't resist as Daniel wrapped his coat around it, barely strong enough to lift its head. It whimpered once, soft, broken. He lifted it carefully, cradling the small body against his chest. Its weight was awkward, but not heavy. Malnourished, Daniel thought grimly. Starved, maybe for days. As he trudged back toward the cabin, snow whipped at his face, trying to blind him. He moved like a man carrying something more than just flesh and bone. He was carrying a life, and somewhere deep down, he hoped it might carry something back into his. Inside, the warmth hit them like a wave. Daniel laid the cub gently on a folded blanket near the fire, stoked the flames higher, then set about cleaning the wound. Old ranger training came back to him in fits and starts. How to dress a wound without making it worse, how to recognize infection, how to tell when it was already too late. But the cub, against all odds, held on. It whimpered under the sting of antiseptic, but didn't bite, didn't thrash, just stared at Daniel with those dark, haunted eyes. He fed it broth, deer meat boiled down with herbs, a little honey, water. At first it turned its head away. But later, as night deepened, and the storm howled like a chorus of wolves. It licked the edge of the bowl. Daniel sat beside the fire, shotgun across his knees, eyes never leaving the cub. He didn't name it that night. He didn't speak much at all. Just watched it breathe, steady and shallow, and thought maybe he'd done something right for once. Morning came slow and pale. The storm had passed, leaving a world sealed in silence and snow. The cabin felt different now, not just warmer, lived in, shared. The cub stirred as Daniel crouched nearby with a fresh bowl of water. "You're still here," he said, surprised at how much that mattered. The cub blinked up at him. Its paw twitched slightly. It was alive. Against reason, against odds, it was still here. He called it Ash. There was something fitting about that name. Something about the soot left behind when fire took everything else. Ash was the reminder, the proof that something had survived. Days turned into a week. Ash's leg, though still stiff and raw, began to heal. He ate more, drank more, slept less. He would lift his head when Daniel entered the room, let out soft grunts when the fire dimmed, and occasionally pressed his cold nose against Daniel's arm. The man found himself talking again. Not just muttering out loud, but talking. About things he hadn't said to anyone. About Charlie, his partner. About the wildfire. About the weight of carrying someone's final scream in your bones. Ash didn't answer, of course, but he listened in the way only animals could, without judgment or pity. Daniel felt lighter after those conversations, though he never admitted it aloud. By the end of the second week, Ash was hobbling across the room, clumsy but determined. His wildness was still there, visible in the way his ears perked at sudden sounds, or how he growled at his reflection in the old mirror above the mantel. But there was trust now, too. Not obedience, not tameness. Something deeper. Respect, perhaps. One night, as the wind blew softer and the stars came out in quiet brilliance, Daniel sat on the porch steps with Ash beside him. The bear's breath came in slow huffs, visible in the cold air. Daniel took a sip of coffee, his gaze lost in the woods beyond. "I don't know what comes next," he said, "for either of us." Ash grunted, then leaned slightly against his side. Daniel didn't move. For the first time in months, he didn't feel alone. The morning light filtered through the frosted windows in soft streaks, casting faint gold across the floorboards as the fire in the hearth hissed low, throwing quiet shadows against the cabin walls. Daniel stirred from the chair he'd dozed off in, joints aching from the awkward position. The warmth of the mug he'd clutched all night long, now reduced to cold dregs. Across from him, nestled in a tangle of wool blankets in an old flannel shirt, the bear cub still lay curled, though its sides rose and fell more steadily than the night before. Daniel blinked the sleep from his eyes, trying to reconcile the surreal truth of what he was seeing with the dull ache of his memories. A black bear cub, wounded, orphaned, lying by his fire like some strange, quiet guest. He rubbed his face, his fingers dragging down the coarse stubble that clung to his jaw. "Still here, huh?" he murmured, voice rough from disuse. The cub didn't stir, but it hadn't died. That meant something. He stood slowly, stretching out a back that cracked in protest, then crossed to the woodpile beside the hearth and threw 2 more logs into the fire. It crackled to life, casting the room in a burst of heat and light. The temperature outside remained brutal. February in this part of Colorado wasn't kind. The snowdrifts out front were up past his thighs, and the generator had struggled all night to keep the backup heat from cutting out. The kettle whistled faintly on the stovetop, and Daniel poured a cup of hot water into the same chipped mug, dropping in pine needles and a sliver of dried lemon. He drank in silence, eyes never straying far from the cub. At some point, he'd need to call someone. Fish and wildlife, the sanctuary north of Telluride, maybe even the ranger office he still had memorized despite the fact he hadn't called it in 6 months. But not yet, not today. Today was just about surviving, for both of them. Midday crept in with no fanfare. Daniel went about his routine as best he could, checked the traps he'd laid in the backwoods, gathered kindling, boiled broth from snowmelt and dried meat. Every time he returned to the cabin, his gaze was drawn to the cub like a lodestar. He worked mostly in silence, the same way he had since the fire, when the noise of people had grown too much and the sound of his own name had begun to sting like a fresh burn. But as the day wore on and the cub's eyes began to track him across the room, Daniel found himself speaking, first in murmurs, then in low, even sentences. "You've got fight in you," he said, as he ladled another portion of broth into a shallow bowl, crouching beside the cub, whose head now lifted ever so slightly. "Takes grit to survive a trap. Most don't. Rangers find bones, blood trails, not eyes looking back." The cub blinked slowly, its ears twitching at the sound of his voice. Daniel set the bowl down and leaned back on his heels. "They say animals don't grieve, but that's a lie. I've seen wolves wail. Elk refuse to leave the fallen. You know loss, don't you?" The words slipped out before he could stop them, and Daniel swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. Me too. That night he dreamed of fire again, of trees splintering like bones, of smoke choking out the sun. In the dream, he carried his partner through ash and flame, legs burning, lungs full of cinders. But he was always too slow. The forest always closed in behind him. He woke with a capum, sweat cold on his skin despite the fire's warmth. Across from him, the cub, still nameless in his mind, stared at him with those fathomless black eyes, its head tilted slightly. Daniel pressed a hand to his chest, grounding himself. "Just a dream, Ash," he said hoarsely, and then paused, surprised at the word that had slipped from his mouth. Ash. It stuck, soft and solid. A name pulled from the ruins, a name that fit. "Ash," he repeated, this time with conviction, and the cub gave a soft huff, closing its eyes as if accepting the title. By the fourth day, Ash stood on trembling legs. He was no longer the skeletal, frostbitten creature Daniel had carried from the woods. His leg, still swollen and wrapped in gauze, supported his weight in short bursts. Daniel watched him from the table where he carved a replacement snare, noting the way Ash's nose lifted to the sense of stew in old wood smoke, the way his ears perked when Daniel moved. There was wildness in him still, of course, flashes of teeth when startled, a stubborn streak that showed when Daniel tried to clean his wound. But there was also a growing gentleness, something less instinct and more recognition. Trust, maybe. It unnerved Daniel more than he wanted to admit. He found himself talking more, recounting pieces of his past in fragments. Stories about backcountry rescues, elk migrations, the wild mare he'd once followed for 10 days straight before she finally let him close enough to see her foal. He didn't know why he spoke, only that the silence no longer swallowed him whole. Ash listened, always listening, as if the stories were wines that stirred something deep and ancient in his bear's heart. At night, the cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. Daniel caught himself laughing once when Ash tried to clumsily paw at a dangling piece of jerky and fell backward with a surprised grunt. The sound startled him. It had been so long. Weeks passed. The snow outside grew denser, heavier, a world still gripped by the fist of winter. But inside, things changed. Daniel cleared space for Ash to move freely, built a low trough of water in the corner using an old drawer and a tarp. He adjusted the stove's output so the heat stayed steady, even when he went out on supply runs. The cub had begun following him from room to room, limping still, but with increasing steadiness. He'd even begun to eat on his own. Daniel didn't call for help. He told himself it was just until spring, just until Ash could walk without pain, fend for himself. But the truth wrapped tighter than snow on a pine branch. He didn't want Ash to go, because Ash had become more than company. He was a presence, a purpose, and Daniel, for the first time since the fire, didn't feel entirely alone. Then came the radio call. Crackling through the old handheld left on the mantel, the voice was familiar. Jenny, a field biologist stationed 70 miles west. "We've had reports of an orphaned cub out near your sector. Traps have been found, too. You seen anything, Hale?" Daniel stared at the radio, heart suddenly loud in his chest. His hand hovered over the device for a long while before pressing the button. "Nothing up here," he lied softly. "Just snow." Behind him, Ash stirred, blinking up from his nest of blankets, his eyes full of that same knowing look that had met Daniel the night they found each other. A look that said, "I am here. I survived. So did you." And Daniel, staring into those deep eyes, whispered back, "So we did." Spring did not arrive with a sudden thaw or the dramatic rush of meltwater, but with small, nearly invisible changes, the snow shrinking by inches instead of feet, birdsong threading cautiously through the trees, the sun lingering a little longer each evening, as though testing its welcome after a long exile. Daniel noticed it first in the way the shadows shifted across the porch in the afternoon, in how the wind no longer bit straight to the bone, but merely grazed the skin. Then he saw it in Ash. The bear had grown noticeably heavier, his coat rich and glossy now, no longer the brittle, patchy mess of frost and blood that Daniel had first carried into his cabin. The limp was still there, but fading, the wounded leg slowly relearning its strength, and every day the cub tested himself further, hobbling outside the door, sniffing at the world like it was new, which in a way it was. Daniel had begun leaving the door open during the warmer hours, letting the scent of pine needles and thawed soil drift in. Ash would rise from his spot near the hearth, lumber toward the threshold with curious eyes, and sit there just on the edge between wild and safe. Neither crossed fully into the other's world, but both had come to recognize the shape of it. Daniel watched Ash's slow, careful movements with a complicated feeling in his chest. There was pride, certainly, relief. But beneath it all, a quiet, persistent ache, like a bruise he couldn't stop pressing. Ash was healing. That meant he wouldn't stay. One afternoon, while Ash was out nosing around the edges of the clearing, Daniel found himself rummaging through an old box tucked beneath his bed. It was filled with ranger gear, maps, compasses, field notes from the years before the fire. He hadn't opened it in months, maybe longer. He pulled out a faded photograph of himself and Charlie, taken at the end of a long trail survey. They were smiling, sunburned, dirt-smudged, arms slung around each other like brothers. Behind them, the Rockies stretched, vast and silent. Daniel stared at the photo for a long time. Then he slipped it into his shirt pocket and walked outside. Ash was sprawled in the patchy grass near the fire pit, snout resting on a large, sun-warmed rock. He raised his head as Daniel approached, blinking sleepily. "You're not limping today," Daniel said, lowering himself to sit a few feet away. Ash huffed softly, then resumed his lounging. "You're getting better faster than I expected," Daniel added, and his voice caught slightly at the end. Ash turned to look at him, head tilted in that way he often did when Daniel spoke, as if trying to understand the meaning rather than just the sound. "You'll be leaving soon," Daniel said, and this time it wasn't a question. Ash didn't answer, couldn't answer, and yet his stillness said everything. The silence that fell between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of truth, and Daniel hated it. 2 days later, the ranger station called again. This time it wasn't just a check-in. They had found a set of paw prints matching a juvenile black bear's in a neighboring valley and were sending a team to investigate. "If you've got anything unusual out your way, now's the time to report it," Jenny's voice crackled through the old radio. Daniel stared at Ash, who was pawing at the earth near the woodpile, flipping a flat stone with surprising delicacy. He hesitated, fingers resting on the transmit button. "Nothing yet," he said at last. "I'll keep an eye out." But the call had set something in motion. They would come looking. It was only a matter of time. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed listening to the wind sift through the eaves, the creak of the old cabin settling into itself. Across the room, Ash was curled in his usual spot, but he stirred more often now, as though sensing the shift. The next morning, Daniel set out early, hiking higher into the ridge than he had in weeks. The sky was impossibly clear, the air thin and sharp. He needed time to think, to breathe. He found himself drawn to the place where the fire had turned, where he'd last seen Charlie alive, where the forest had burned so hot the ground itself had blistered. Now, months later, the blackened skeletons of trees still stood like mourners, frozen mid-scream. Daniel stood among them, feeling the way silence pressed down like snow. He knelt and touched the earth. Something green was growing there. Tiny shoots, impossibly fragile. Life, returning. He sat for a long time before turning back. When he returned to the cabin, Ash was gone. Panic surged up his spine like cold water. He dropped his pack and called out, then immediately felt foolish. Ash didn't come when called. He wasn't a dog, but still, Daniel searched the perimeter, then the tree line, his chest tightening more with each empty moment. An hour later, he found Ash halfway down the trail that led toward the valley floor. The bear was just sitting there, as if waiting. He looked back at Daniel, then forward again, nose lifting to the breeze. Wild called. And he had answered. Daniel stood there, not moving. He wanted to run forward, to grab Ash by the scruff, drag him back, scream, not yet. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he sat down beside him. The two of them watched the sunset bleed slowly over the ridgeline. "I can't keep you," Daniel whispered, and the words felt like stones in his throat. "And I shouldn't." Ash exhaled through his nose, low and steady. Daniel reached out, resting a hand lightly on the thick fur between Ash's shoulders. The bear didn't flinch. "When you go," Daniel said, "go knowing you were the reason I stayed, that I came back." The next morning, Ash was gone. No paw prints by the door, no trail to follow, just absence. Daniel stood on the porch a long while, eyes scanning the edge of the trees. He didn't cry. Not then. He went inside and sat beside the cold fireplace, hands resting on his knees, listening to the hum of the waking forest. Days passed, then weeks. The snow retreated in earnest, green returned to the land, birds nested beneath the eaves. Life, undeterred, resumed its ancient rhythm. Daniel found himself fixing the roof one day, then reassembling the old wood sign that hung near the trailhead. Hale Ranger Station. He hadn't touched it since the fire. He cleaned the lettering with oil and cloth, then added something beneath it in smaller letters: Wildlife Sanctuary. When Jenny radioed again, he didn't dodge. He told her about Ash, about the injury, the weeks of recovery. He expected anger, maybe even a fine, but she just listened, then said, "He's lucky he found you." Daniel replied, "No, I was the lucky one." Later that spring, a local rescue brought in an injured fox kit, then a fawn whose mother had been hit by a snowplow. People began calling. Donations arrived. The station became something more than it had ever been, a place for healing, for second chances. Daniel didn't advertise. He didn't need to. Word of mouth did the work. A year later, on a fog-thick morning in April, Daniel was walking the perimeter with two teenage volunteers when he saw it. A shape at the edge of the woods. Broad, familiar. A black bear, full-grown now, standing at the tree line, eyes fixed on the cabin. Daniel stopped. So did the bear. Neither moved for a long moment. Then Ash turned and disappeared into the trees. Daniel smiled. He didn't call after him. He didn't need to. Some bonds didn't break. They simply stretched across distance, tethered by memory, by gratitude, by love that spoke not in words, but in survival, in presence, in returning. And in the quiet hush of a Colorado morning, with spring humming through the forest, and the ghosts of fire turned to ash beneath new growth, Daniel Hale stood at the edge of the wild and knew finally that he had come home. The summer that followed was unlike any Daniel Hale had ever known. Not because the forest transformed in any dramatic or magical way, though it did, as it always did, the snow replaced by wildflowers, the silence of winter giving way to buzzing insects and birdsong, but because Daniel himself had changed. His hands, once accustomed to solitude, now moved through the world with purpose again. They cradled orphaned kits, cleaned wounds, rebuilt fences, and gently guided the trembling hands of visiting children toward injured animals with patience he hadn't known still lived in him. The ranger station had bloomed into something more than a forgotten outpost. It had become a sanctuary not only for wildlife, but for people. Word of mouth had reached further than Daniel expected. A local vet partnered with him, donating medicine and time. A therapist from the nearest town began organizing weekend retreats for troubled youth. Kids chewed up by the world and looking for something, anything that didn't judge or demand. They came in small groups, wide-eyed and wary, their stories tight behind clenched jaws and hardened shoulders. But something happened when they stood face to face with a wounded animal. They softened, they listened, they let themselves be seen, and Daniel quietly saw himself in each of them. He didn't talk about the fire unless asked. When he did, he kept it simple. "We lost someone out there. I couldn't bring him back." Sometimes that was all it took. One of the older kids, a boy named Tyler, who hadn't spoken more than 10 words in his first 2 visits, sat beside him after those words and whispered, "Me too." They didn't say anything else. They didn't need to. On another morning, Daniel found a girl named Emmy standing by the trailhead sign, staring at the second line. Wildlife Sanctuary. She had a stitch fox plush tucked under her arm and tears shining in her eyes. "Why'd you make this place?" she asked. Daniel crouched beside her, resting a hand on his knee. Because sometimes, he said, when you help something wild heal, it heals you right back. She didn't respond, but she reached up and held his hand for a moment. That was enough. Each day, Daniel moved through the rhythms of this new life with a kind of quiet reverence. Feedings, phone calls, trail walks, injuries mended, new arrivals. The station was never full. He kept it small on purpose. But the space felt vibrant now, alive. On the wall inside the main cabin, next to a bulletin board filled with names and dates and snapshots, he pinned a photo he'd finally printed. It was one he'd taken months ago, not long after Ash first stood without falling. In it, the bear's eyes were turned toward the light streaming through the cabin window, his body lean but solid, a shadow of strength behind the soft fur. Daniel titled the photo, Ash, Day 34. Beneath it, in his tight block handwriting, he'd written, "Sometimes we survive because someone decides we're worth saving." It was late September when the letters started arriving. Not emails or digital forms, actual letters, folded sheets of paper in worn envelopes, scrawled in careful handwriting. One from a retired ranger in Montana who had read about the sanctuary in a conservation journal. Another from a mother whose son had visited in June and hadn't stopped talking about the place where animals make people better. They came with donations sometimes, or sketches, or short stories kids had written about their time with the animals. Daniel kept every one. He read them slowly like sacred things. Sometimes they made him cry, but he didn't hide the tears anymore. Then one morning, deep in October, as the first frost clung to the windows and the trees began to blush with orange and gold, Daniel stepped outside and froze. There at the edge of the clearing, framed by the rising sun and mist curling low to the ground, stood Ash. He was larger now, no longer a cub, but a full-grown bear, his shoulders wide and powerful, his coat rich and thick for the coming winter. But it was his eyes that held Daniel, eyes that hadn't changed at all. Ash didn't move. He didn't need to. Daniel stepped off the porch and crossed the clearing in silence, stopping a dozen feet away. They stood like that for a long moment, two creatures marked by survival, by wounds, by the strange grace of choosing not to give up. "You came back," Daniel said, his voice barely a whisper. Ash tilted his head, just slightly. Daniel smiled, heart swelling with a pressure that was neither pain nor joy, but some potent mixture of both. "I don't know why," he added, "but thank you." Ash didn't stay. He turned after a while and vanished into the trees as quiet as he'd come. Daniel didn't follow. That was the thing about love, about respect, about the wild. You didn't hold it too tight. You let it choose. You let it return. Or not. Either way, you kept the door open. That evening, he added another photo to the wall, a snapshot of the clearing with Ash in the distance, half silhouetted by the morning light. Beneath it, he wrote, "He never really left." The first snowfall came in November, soft and silent, coating the sanctuary in white. Daniel stood on the porch as it fell, warm coffee in hand, scarf wrapped loose around his neck. Behind him, the cabin glowed with firelight. Inside, a rescued owl named Cinder blinked at him from her perch by the window. In the back room, two volunteers, teenagers from the weekend retreat, were carefully spoon-feeding an injured raccoon. Laughter drifted through the door. The kind of laughter that was healing, not loud but real. Daniel listened, heart full. And then, slowly, he walked down the porch steps and into the falling snow. He didn't need to go far, just far enough to stand in the place where Ash had once collapsed, all broken bone and frozen breath, the day everything had changed. He crouched there now, pressing his palm to the snow-covered earth. "Thank you," he whispered again, though there was no one there to hear it. Or maybe there was. The wind stirred the trees gently, like breath on skin. Daniel stood. The sanctuary would carry on. There would always be more to rescue, more to mend, more to teach and learn and unlearn. But this was the moment he had waited for. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, certain, whole. Later that night, as the snow thickened and stars blinked faintly through the drifting clouds, Daniel lit a lantern and wrote in the old logbook he kept by the door. He documented the weather, the new arrivals, the status of the fox with the fractured leg. And then, without thinking too much, he wrote one final entry at the bottom of the page. Saw him again today. Strong, wild, free, no longer mine, but still part of me. He closed the book, set the pen down, and leaned back in his chair, the fire warm against his boots, the sanctuary quiet and alive around him. And outside, beneath the whispering trees, somewhere in the wide dark of the forest, Ash moved through the snow without fear, as though the world at last had made room for both the wild and the wounded, as though some things once broken didn't just heal, but became something stronger than before. Attackers thought she was easy prey, until her secret defender left them terrified. The morning broke with a crystalline stillness over Pinecrest, the kind that only the deep wilderness of Montana could summon. Frost glazed every branch and roof, and smoke from wood stoves coiled upward like prayers in the cold air. Anna Woodson stood at her kitchen window, mug of tea in hand, watching the sun ease its way over Blackwater Ridge. At 78, her life moved at a rhythm that matched the seasons, deliberate, unhurried, familiar. Her cabin, built by her late husband over 50 years ago, creaked gently in the wind like an old friend shifting its bones. She found comfort in the way the floor groaned underfoot, the way the fire popped and hissed in the stone hearth, the way silence no longer frightened her. In Pinecrest, everyone knew everyone, and most had already faded into memory or gone down the mountain to warmer, easier places. But Anna remained, too rooted, too stubborn, and too full of memories to leave. She had long since made peace with her solitude. So when a knock came at her door that morning, sharp, insistent, out of place, she paused. The only people who visited unannounced were neighbors in trouble, or worse, opportunists. She opened the door with caution, one hand on the knob, the other resting unconsciously on her hip. There, framed by the brittle light of morning, stood Jack Turner. Jack was well known in Pinecrest, not for kindness or community spirit, but for his reputation as a hunter with more ego than ethics. He wore his usual camouflage jacket, a knife strapped to his thigh, and a smug expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. But what drew Anna's gaze wasn't Jack. It was what he held in his arms, a small, trembling creature wrapped in a worn plaid towel. Found him near the ridge, Jack said, tilting his head toward the bundle. Mama must have been killed. Some kind of rare cub. Maybe exotic. Can't say I've ever seen one quite like him. Anna frowned and leaned closer. The animal was tiny, no bigger than a house cat, with thick, tawny fur that shimmered gold where the sun hit it. His ears were rounded, his snout short, and his amber eyes blinked up at her with a slow, uncertain curiosity. Her breath caught. There was something in those eyes, something not wild, not yet. He needs care, Jack added, rocking the creature gently in his arms. And I'm not the caregiving type. Thought maybe you'd want him. $200 or $300 and he's yours. Anna stared at him. That's half my check, Jack. Fine, he said with a shrug. Make it 2. I'd rather see him with you than with some idiot from town who'd throw him scraps and call it love. Her heart tugged. It was reckless, foolish even. But something in the animal's stillness, how he didn't recoil or whimper, reminded her of another creature long gone. She thought of the old tabby her husband used to dote on, the one who stole socks and slept in her knitting basket. Mick. Without letting her face give away her decision, Anna reached for her purse and counted out the bills with deliberate fingers. 200, she said, no more. Jack grinned, placed the bundle in her arms, and turned without another word. The moment the door clicked shut, Anna looked down into the creature's eyes. You're not just any cub, she murmured. You're someone, aren't you? She named him Mick, after the cat. It seemed fitting. At first he was clumsy and quiet, hiding beneath the coffee table or curling near the warmth of the stove. She fashioned a bed from an old laundry basket, but he preferred her worn slippers and the rag rug beside her chair. He ate little at first, cooked chicken, soft bread, scrambled eggs. But within a week he was demanding raw meat, his appetite growing as quickly as his limbs. In just days, his body lengthened, his paws thickened, and the soft pads under his feet took on the quiet heaviness of something meant for forest floor, not cabin wood. Still, he was gentle. When she tripped near the porch stairs, it was Mick who trotted over, pressed his furry side against her until she could rise. When her joints flared on cold nights, he lay beside her like a breathing hot water bottle, his head resting on her knee. He watched her with those same amber eyes, never blinking long, never wandering far. Anna talked to him like she would to an old friend, and sometimes she thought he understood. "It's not the craziest thing I've done," she told him once while slicing venison. "That would be marrying your namesake after only 2 months of courting." Mick licked his paw and blinked at her, as if to say he approved. It was nearly 6 weeks later when Maria arrived. The sound of her tires crunching on gravel was the only warning Anna got before her granddaughter burst through the front door, all windblown hair and teacher's urgency. "Grandma, you forgot to answer your phone again. I've been trying to—" She froze mid-step. Mick, now nearly waist-high and watching from the kitchen, didn't move. Maria did. "Jesus," she breathed. "Grandma, what is that?" "That's Mick," Anna replied calmly, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "He's a cub, or was, growing fast." "That's not a cub. That's a black bear." Anna shook her head, half amused. "He's not wild. He knows me." "Grandma—" Maria stepped forward, then froze as Mick patted closer, sniffing her boots, but never growling, never raising a paw. "He's tame," Anna said. "He's never hurt me. Not once." Maria looked at her stunned. "You can't keep a black bear in your house. It's illegal. It's dangerous." "He's not dangerous to me." "He will be," Maria whispered. "Not by choice. By instinct." Anna's face softened, and for the first time Maria saw the weight of age in her expression. "I know how it sounds," Anna said, "but he saved me in ways I can't explain. And I think, no, I know, I've saved him too." Maria sighed, rubbing her temples. She looked at Mick, who had returned to his spot beside the fire, curled like a bun who had never known the wild. Her voice lowered. "Let me look into it. Maybe there's a way. A wildlife ambassador permit or something. But you can't let anyone else see him. Not yet. You'll lose him." "Then I won't let anyone see him," Anna replied. And that was how it began, the fragile alliance between generations, stitched together by something wild, something ancient, and something entirely new. In the hush of Pinecrest, beneath snow-heavy pines, an old woman and a growing bear sat side by the fire, unaware that change, like spring wind through the pass, was already stirring. Spring crept into Pinecrest like a shy guest, arriving slowly beneath melting snow and the soft return of birdsong. The long white hush of winter gave way to the drip-drip of thawing eaves, the murmurs of creeks breaking free from their icy prisons, and the scent of pine sap warmed by tentative sun. Anna felt the change deep in her bones. Each year the season returned, but this time it came with a different kind of awakening. One wrapped in fur and instinct, slumber and mystery. Mick was no longer a cub. His limbs had lengthened, his gait now powerful and deliberate, his coat a lustrous sheen of dark brown threaded with golden undertones that caught the light like sun on riverstones. He moved with an uncanny grace, neither pet nor predator, and yet somehow both. He understood Anna's voice, followed her without command, and pressed his head gently against her side when she sat too long by the stove. Still, he grew restless. He paced more, watched the trees longer. Something in the wind stirred him. Sometimes at dawn he would disappear for an hour, reappearing at the cabin door with pine needles clinging to his fur, his breath misting in the chill, his eyes lit with something Anna couldn't name. She didn't stop him. He always returned, and she trusted that he knew where his boundaries lay. Maria had kept her word. She researched quietly, reaching out to wildlife specialists, whispering inquiries into state regulations and obscure permits. Some were skeptical, others intrigued. Most didn't believe the story. "A bear," one had said on the phone, "being raised by a 78-year-old woman? That's not just unadvisable, it's unprecedented." But Maria persisted. She crafted proposals. She collected documentation. She took secret videos of Mick sitting calmly as Anna read to him from an old gardening book. Educational animal, she'd typed over and over. Ambassador for conservation. Unintentional rescue. Long-term bonding. Yet she knew they were racing the clock. It only took one person to see Mick, one slip, one misunderstanding, and the consequences could be irreversible. She urged Anna to be careful, and Anna listened, up to a point. She still took Mick for twilight walks behind the cabin, deep into the trees where no neighbors wandered. She still left the side window open at night so he could come and go as he pleased. "He's not mine to keep," she admitted once, "but he's mine to protect." Well, then, as if conjured from the growing warmth, trouble arrived in Pinecrest. Not in the form of a bear, but something far noisier. Kyle Tanner, 26, entitled, and recently arrived to claim the cabin he'd inherited from his uncle. What he didn't inherit was any of his uncle's quiet respect for the land. Kyle brought friends, 3 of them, loud and careless. Their trucks tore up the gravel roads. Music blared at night from bonfires that crackled beneath the trees too dry from winter to be safe. Beer cans littered the trails. Dogs barked. Arguments broke out in the village store. The sheriff, Dan Hadley, tried to keep order, but he was a single man with a part-time deputy in a town too tired to fight every fire. The complaints piled up, but Kyle didn't seem to care. When Maria crossed paths with him at the library, his smirk lingered too long. "Cute little town," he said. "Shame it's so full of boring people." She didn't answer. She only walked faster. But Kyle noticed. He always noticed. One afternoon, Maria stayed late at the schoolhouse, preparing a lesson about wildlife corridors and animal habitats. She packed up just before sunset, pulling on her jacket as the sky turned soft with golden pink hues. The path home led through the park, a gentle trail flanked by young firs and benches carved with the names of donors long gone. She walked it often, trusted it. This time it betrayed her. Kyle and 2 of his friends stepped out from behind the trail sign, their laughter low and unpleasant. "Evening, Teach," Kyle said, stepping into her path. His eyes were glassy. "Going somewhere?" Maria stopped. "Out of the way, Kyle." "Or what?" he said, spreading his arms. "You gonna call the sheriff again? That guy couldn't catch a cold." One of the others laughed, stepping closer. Maria's heart began to pound. The trail was empty. The sun was dipping fast. She gripped her bag tighter and turned to walk back the way she came, but the 3rd man stepped behind her. "Don't," she said. Her voice trembled. They smiled, and then the woods behind them exploded. A roar shattered the air, low and deep and primal, like the mountain itself had spoken. The men froze. From the underbrush burst a blur of motion, fur, claws, teeth, and fury. Mick. He reared up, taller now than any of them, his mouth open in a snarl that left no room for doubt. His amber eyes locked on Kyle. He stepped forward, paw hitting the ground with a thud that echoed like a drum. Kyle scrambled back. Jesus, it's a bear!" one of them screamed. They bolted, crashing through the trees like spooked deer, shouts fading into the distance. Maria stood trembling. Mick turned to her, his breathing heavy. He stepped closer, his massive head lowering until it pressed gently against her shoulder. She wrapped her arms around his neck and cried into his fur. "You followed me," she whispered. "You found me." They walked home together in silence, the sun dipping behind the ridge, shadows stretching long over the forest floor. Anna was waiting at the porch, and when she saw them, she knew. She didn't need words. She saw it in Maria's face, in the way Mick walked beside her like a sentry. That night, there were no more secrets. The next morning, Sheriff Dan Hadley came by. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking tired but resolute. "Heard what happened in the park," he said. "Kyle's story got around." Anna nodded. "It's true. He says it was a bear, says it attacked them." "He didn't attack," Maria said firmly. "He protected me." Dan looked at the great creature lying peacefully beneath the porch swing. Mick blinked at him, silent and still. "That bear's not the problem," Dan said at last. "The problem is people like Kill. But law's the law. If word spreads..." "We're working on a permit," Maria said quickly. "An ambassador animal for conservation education. He's been raised since infancy. He's gentle. We have video, notes, witnesses." Dan exhaled. "Then work fast. Because if Fish and Game gets wind of this before the papers are in order, it won't matter how sweet that bear is." He turned to Anna. "You've kept this town safe more times than I can count. You've earned some grace, but we need to do this right." Anna reached down and ran her fingers through Mick's fur. "We will," she said. "He's not just my bear. He's Pinecrest's now." And in that moment, they all understood something deeper. That sometimes the guardians we need aren't the ones who walk on two legs, and that family doesn't end at blood or species. Sometimes it begins with a knock on the door, a foolish choice, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. The weeks that followed shifted the heartbeat of Pinecrest in ways no one could have predicted. Mick, now impossible to mistake for anything but what he was, a North American black bear in his adolescent prime, became the unspoken myth of the village, half whispered in grocery aisles and murmured over mugs of black coffee at the general store. Yet, the people of Pinecrest, shaped by harsh winters and a quiet respect for all things wild, responded not with outrage, but with cautious reverence. Stories spread faster than facts. The children were the first to believe, because belief comes easily when you are young and the world still holds magic. They told tales of a golden-eyed guardian who patrolled the woods, who watched over hikers and scared off mountain lions. They said he had a name, and those who were kind could whisper it into the trees and feel safer, even in the deep shadows of dusk. Maria leaned into the tide of wonder, not to deceive, but to protect. She and Anna worked late into the night piecing together every requirement for the Wildlife Ambassador permit, documenting Mick's behavior, his growth, his daily routines. They filmed him responding to Anna's soft-spoken cues, sitting beside her as she read from worn pages, pawing gently at her lap when she paused. They captured footage of him at rest, breathing slow and steady like a child in slumber, his great frame curled at the hearth. She interviewed townsfolk, gathering testimony from those who had seen him or heard the story of how he defended Maria, each account laced not with fear but with awe. Sheriff Hadley provided a signed letter of support. "He's not a menace," it read in careful script. "He's a presence, and sometimes a presence is exactly what a town needs." Even old Hank Donner, who hadn't spoken more than 5 words to anyone in years, walked into the library one morning, set a small envelope on the counter, and left without a word. Inside was a photo, yellowed with time, of a much younger Hank beside a bear cub at a wildlife station, a note scrawled on the back. "They know more than we give them credit for." Still, the air held tension. Kyle Tanner and his friends hadn't returned to town since the incident, but their presence lingered like a bruise beneath the skin of the village. There were murmurs that Kyle was trying to stir attention online, posting half-truths and grainy footage that showed nothing but forest shadows and trembling hands. Maria found one video with the title, "Small Town Harbors Wild Bear as Pet, Danger to a Community." It had a few hundred views, nothing viral, but it made her blood run cold. "We're running out of time," she told Anna one morning as she sorted through permit applications and legal forms spread across the kitchen table. "If someone from the state gets spooked, they'll send agents, and they won't care how well-behaved he is." Anna didn't answer right away. She was stirring a pot of stew, her hand moving slow, thoughtful. Mick lay by the back door, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but listening. "He's not a danger," Anna said at last. "He's a soul. That's the difference. And I'll be damned if some clipboard-wielding stranger tells me he's nothing more than a wild animal." Maria knew better than to argue. The truth lived in that cabin, in the way Mick nuzzled Anna's shoulder when she dozed off in the chair, in the way he pressed his massive body between Maria and danger without hesitation, in the way the house no longer felt like a place waiting for time to pass, but a home filled with quiet purpose. The permit, when it finally came, arrived in a plain envelope with the state seal in the corner. Maria tore it open on the porch while Anna watched with unreadable eyes. The words were there, black on white. Educational animal permit, granted for one North American black bear named Mick, under the custodianship of Anna Woodson and Maria Reyes, effective immediately. Anna smiled faintly. "About time," she said, but Maria saw the glisten in her eyes. With the permit came responsibility and visibility. Mick's presence could no longer remain a secret, which meant careful planning, training sessions, controlled interactions. They contacted a wildlife rehabilitation expert, a kind-eyed woman named Celeste, who drove up from Missoula and stayed 3 days to observe. She watched Mick move through the woods like a silent shadow, returning only when Anna whistled the tune she always hummed while shelling peas. Celeste took notes, asked questions, and finally sat by the fire one evening and said, "He's a miracle, and miracles need guardians." It was decided Mick would make his first public appearance at the Pinecrest Elementary Spring Fair, an event that had once been little more than lemonade stands and priambai baking contests, but now carried an air of hushed excitement. Flyers went up quietly, marked with simple words: learning from nature, a visit from Mick the Bear. The day arrived soft and sunny, wildflowers nodding in the breeze. The schoolyard bustled with laughter, the scent of kettle corn and barbecue wafting through the air. Children darted between booths, their eyes shining with anticipation. A roped-off area had been set up beneath the old cottonwoods, a patch of shaded earth where Anna sat in her rocking chair, a broad sun hat perched on her head. Mick stood nearby, calm, his size awe-inspiring but his demeanor as gentle as ever. Maria spoke to the gathered crowd. She told Mick's story not as a tale of recklessness, but of compassion, a choice made not in ignorance but in hope. She spoke of trust earned, of lessons learned, of the way kindness could grow into something powerful enough to change an entire town. The children were entranced. One little girl stepped forward, eyes wide, and held out a drawing. Crayon-sketched trees, a cabin, and a golden-eyed bear standing beside an old woman. Mick leaned forward, sniffed the page, and let out a soft chuff that made the girl giggle and the crowd laugh gently. From that day on, Mick became more than a curiosity. He became a symbol of Pinecrest's heart, of its resilience, of the bridge between wild and human that could exist if built with care. People who had once scoffed at Anna's decision began to drop by the cabin with questions, with fruit, with poems left on the porch. Tourists heard whispers and asked cautiously, "Is it true? Do you really have a bear?" And if Anna trusted them, she'd smile and say, "He's not mine, but he's part of us." Kyle Tanner never returned. Rumor had it he tried to sell his property and left town claiming Pinecrest had gone full Twilight Zone. But the town didn't mind. The nights felt safer, the woods quieter. And every now and then, hikers would swear they saw something golden watching them from the trees, only to find themselves strangely unafraid. On her porch one evening, as twilight spilled lilac and gold across the sky, Anna sat with Mick at her feet and Maria beside her. The air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine and faraway thunder. "You think they'll believe it?" Anna asked. "That we raised a bear and the town didn't fall apart?" Maria smiled, resting her head on her grandmother's shoulder. "I think the truth doesn't always need believing. Sometimes it just needs living." Mick rumbled low in his chest, a contented sound that felt like home. And in that moment, with the forest humming its ancient lullaby and the stars waiting patiently to rise, Pinecrest exhaled, its heartbeat slow, steady, and full of peace. The first snow of winter came early to Pinecrest that year, dusting the pine needles and rooftops with a delicate shimmer, as if the sky itself had paused to admire the quiet beauty below. The cabin at the edge of the village, once weathered and lonely, now seemed wrapped in warmth despite the cold, a place not just lived in, but deeply loved. Inside, the fireplace crackled with a steady rhythm, casting golden light on the floor where Mick lay curled, his massive frame rising and falling with each slow breath. His fur had darkened over the months, but still gleamed with those faint threads of gold, especially when the firelight caught just right. Anna sat in her rocking chair, a knit blanket over her knees, her hands idle in her lap, not from weariness but from contentment. She watched the snow fall through the window, every flake a soft echo of the life she now lived. A life that, just a year ago, had been so still she could hear her own heart breaking. But not anymore. Mick stirred, raising his head as Maria entered, cheeks flushed from the cold, a scarf looped around her neck and snow melting on her boots. She carried a stack of papers under one arm and a smile that bloomed the moment she saw the two of them by the fire. "You've got another invitation," she said, holding out the envelope. "Missoula Science Center this time. They want to feature Mick in their Living with Wildlife series." Anna chuckled softly. "He's going to need a manager soon. You taking applications?" Maria grinned as she sat cross-legged on the rug beside Mick, who immediately stretched out one paw toward her in a lazy, familiar gesture. He already has one. He just pays in nose boops and muddy footprints. Mick let out a soft huff, the sound Anna had come to recognize as a kind of bear laughter, and rested his chin gently on Maria's lap. In the months since his permit was approved, Mick had become something rare, both legend and reality. School children sent letters addressed simply to Mick the Bear, Pinecrest, and somehow they all found their way to the cabin. Environmentalists and biologists reached out, some skeptical, some awestruck, all curious. How had a wild animal come to live not only among humans but alongside them, not in fear or submission, but in harmony? And the answer, Anna always said, was simple: love. Not a fanciful, fragile kind, but a love built on trust, earned over time, fed with patience and respect. It was that love that had carried her through the lonely winters and brought Maria home from the city, drawn not by duty but by something deeper, a reconnection to her roots, her family, her own sense of purpose. Together, they built something they hadn't even known was missing, a life full of meaning. Still, the world didn't always understand. There were close calls. A wildlife blogger with more ambition than empathy tried to sneak onto the property, hoping for a viral video. He was met not with claws, but with Sheriff Hadley and a very persuasive lecture about boundaries, both natural and legal. Others came with genuine intentions, bringing educational tools, offering collaboration. Maria had even begun drafting a book, The Bear at My Grandmother's Door: Lessons from Pinecrest. The title still made Anna shake her head. A little dramatic, she'd said. It was a knock, not a march. But it changed everything, as Maria would reply. And she wasn't wrong. One afternoon, a hiker from the city got lost near Blackwater Ridge during an early snowfall. By the time the search party was organized, night had fallen and temperatures were dropping fast. The man was found hours later, shaken, cold, but alive. There was something out there, he'd said over and over. Something big. It didn't hurt me. It guided me. Every time I veered off, it stood in the way. I followed it back to the trail. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. Mick had found him. After that, stories flourished like frost on windows. Whispers of a bear who watched over the forest, who stood between danger and the lost, who lived with the old woman who never left Pinecrest. The legend became a comfort, not a threat. Children waved at the woods when they passed. Locals left apples and squash near the tree line in thanks. It was as if the whole town had entered into a pact: protect what protects us. As Anna neared her 80th birthday, Maria suggested a celebration. Nothing big, she promised, already drafting a list of guests. Just the people who matter. Some cider, maybe a cake shaped like a bear. Only if it doesn't scare Mick, Anna said, laughing. The day came clear and cold, with sunlight dancing on the snowbanks. The cabin buzzed with life. Neighbors, old friends, even Sheriff Hadley with his wife and grandkids. They brought stories and handmade gifts, scarves and pies, and a carved wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Mick's Den, home of Pinecrest's gentle giant." Mick, ever the center of attention, tolerated the gathering with dignified patience. Children shyly reached out to touch his thick fur, and he responded with slow blinks and soft, huffing breaths. When one toddler lost her mitten, Mick gently nudged it back to her with his nose, causing the whole crowd to erupt in laughter and applause. As the sun dipped behind the trees and the guests filtered away, Maria stood beside Anna on the porch, both wrapped in blankets, warm mugs in their hands. "You ever think about how it all started?" Maria asked, her voice soft. Anna smiled, watching Mick roam the edge of the clearing, his great frame outlined in gold. "Every day," she said. "One knock, one choice, and everything changed." Maria looked at her. "Do you regret it? Taking him in?" Anna's eyes glistened, but her voice was steady. "Not for a second. He gave me more than I could have ever given him." She paused, then added, "And he brought you back. That's a gift I'll never stop being grateful for." They stood in silence a while longer, listening to the wind in the trees, the slow crunch of Mick's steps in the snow. Finally, Maria whispered, "Sometimes the ones we think need saving." Anna nodded. "End up saving us." The stars began to prick the sky one by one, and Mick returned to the porch, settling down beside Anna's chair with a deep, contented sigh. She reached down and stroked his fur, fingers brushing the place just behind his ear where he liked to be scratched. "You hear that, Mick?" she said, voice low and full of affection. "You did good, my boy. You did real good." And in the hush of that quiet winter night, with the forest listening and the cabin aglow, The bear, who had once been a trembling bundle in a plaid towel, closed his eyes and rested, not just at her feet, but in the very heart of Pinecrest, where he belonged.